Hello, Russ Medge here. I'm at Haystack Mountain Orchard in Wyoming, and I just want to do a quick orchard tour, but this will be specifically for the pests that we deal with on a regular basis and how we manage some of those. So here we go. Probably one of the most common pests that people deal with in orchards or in rural areas are deer, and they can be some of the most destructive animals. If you look here, all these lower branches are munched on, the leaves are chewed away. Deer don't have upper teeth, they just have the lower teeth, so they grab onto these branches and they just kind of yank, and oftentimes they're breaking branches. They love to eat the tips. You would think they're woody, but they love those little tender shoots on the tips plus the leaves. And so if you look at this orchard, most of the trees have been kind of naturally pruned up to about a deer's face level. So the canopies are kind of built up to where the deer, they're kind of lazy. They like to just feed on that lower branches and leaves. If they're really hungry, they'll get on their hind legs and they'll eat branches out of the tops of the trees, but luckily they have a whole forest to browse on, and so they're kind of lazy. They just eat what's close to them. And so what we have to do in the orchard to keep the deer at bay, especially when the trees are young, we have to fence each individual tree. And once the trees get large enough to where their canopy's up high and the fruit is out of reach, we can stop fencing them, but they do browse on those lower branches. So that's the first pest. Another pest that we deal with on a regular basis is gophers. They do like to eat the roots of our fruit trees. Sometimes a mature fruit tree will just start to tip over a little bit, and we have to support it and try to eliminate the gophers with traps, and then we have to support the tree so that it can regrow those roots. Sometimes that will slow the tree's growth down, and the tree will become less productive for a season while we try to take care of the gopher problem. We find that most of the gophers are kind of on the margins of the orchard, the fence lines, and the trees on the edges seem to be the ones that get hit the hardest. This young tree we planted last year is barely hanging on. In the spring, after the snow melt, I just pulled this tree right up out of the ground. The gophers had just eaten 100% of the roots, and there was just a stem in the ground. And so because of all this mulch and then a wet spring, the soil moisture was high enough for long enough that the tree was able to put on new roots, and it feels pretty sturdy now. I can't pull it out of the ground, so I'm going to leave it, and hopefully it will recover and come back in the spring. There's just a few leaves on there barely keeping it alive, and hopefully the gophers will leave it alone this winter and allow it to kind of recover for next spring. Okay, another pest is these blister mites. So you can see on these leaves, it's easier to see on the back side, these little blisters are little microscopic mites that feed on the leaf inside between the two layers of the epidermis of the leaf. And so we can't really spray them. They're protected once they're inside, but in the fall those little mites will migrate into the buds, and we can spray in the fall. And then in the spring, as the buds are swelling and the leaves are about to come out, we can spray again, trying to catch those mites before they get inside that leaf. Once they're in there, I don't worry too much about them. This is something that we just kind of manage, but it doesn't really affect the fruit. Sometimes if it's a really bad infestation, you'll get little blisters on the fruit. For the most part, the blister mites stay inside those leaves, but it is something that we try to manage with copper and neem oil. A dormant oil spray in the spring with copper in it, and then we spray copper and neem oil in the fall, and this also helps with fungal diseases that might be overwintering in the leaf buds. And this is a real serious pest on our orchard. We have all this grass. The grasshoppers get big and plentiful in the summertime. Right now it's starting to cool off, so they're getting a little lethargic. One of the best tools for managing these little guys are poultry of sorts. We used to have some chickens on the orchard, but due to predators, it seems like they're more work than they're worth, especially in our long winters. It's really hard to keep them alive, especially with all the other foxes, raccoons, weasels that like to feed on them in the wintertime. And then in the summer, we have lots of eagles. Sometimes just the neighbors' dogs are the worst pests when it comes to feeding on our chickens. But any sort of poultry will go through this orchard and just devour the grasshoppers, and they seem to do a really good job at keeping them at bay. And this tree, you can see the canopy looks nice and healthy here. But as we go down, these leaves are kind of sickly. This grass was really tall around this tree, and this is the damage the grasshoppers did this summer. Like I mentioned before, when it gets cool, they kind of slow down quite a bit, but you can see where the grasshoppers, they eat the edges of the leaves and leave just big cutouts of the leaf. And this whole tree down low where the grass was up around the lower branches got eaten really bad by grasshoppers. So one thing that we could do better next year is to trim that grass down right around the trunk earlier in the season so that the grasshoppers stay in the grass and don't attack the canopy. And so this little tree is the opposite. We had mulch around this tree, so it had a nice healthy lower canopy. There's still a little bit of grasshopper damage, but the top of this tree is just destroyed. And I see grasshoppers up here, but that's not really what caused the damage. What caused the damage here was a whole bunch of caterpillars. We were able to pick them off, and the caterpillars are pretty easily maintained with Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. It's a natural bacteria that will infect the gut of any sort of caterpillar, any sort of moth or butterfly larva, and cause them to get sick and die. The good thing about this is it happened late enough in the season that the buds set for next year. So we have all the little microscopic flower parts and leaf parts inside that bud just sitting dormant this fall and winter, and it should just emerge in the spring totally fine, even though the leaves got eaten off the top of that tree. In our pie cherry trees, we get this lacing of the leaves where something feeds on that epidermal layer of the leaf. This is a dead one, but it's a pear leaf slug or cherry leaf slug. I mean, this is on a cherry tree, but it's just a wasp larva. It's not an actual slug, but it's just a wasp larva that looks a lot like a little slug, and it will eat the outer layer of the leaves, leaving the veins in place, and it creates that kind of lacy windows on the leaves. This is something that can easily be treated with any sort of organic pesticide or diatomaceous earth, but again, we kind of treat this as needed. Usually it seems like their life cycle is either short enough that it doesn't cause serious damage to the canopy, or we have other predatory insects and birds and stuff that seem to feed on them, because for one, a lot of these are already dead. They're kind of drying out. I don't know if that's a parasite or what caused them to die out, but then none of these are actually alive anymore. So we can treat for them, but usually they don't cause any major damage to the tree, the overall health of the tree, or the fruit. So something we just kind of live with for the most part. And one of the good things about organic gardening, organic orcharding, is that we do have lots of beneficial bugs and birds and snakes, different animals that eat lots of the bugs and the bad stuff. And it's one of the benefits to having organic methods on your orchard. And one of the reasons why we don't like to spray a lot of insecticides in the orchard is because we've got some bees here, and the bees help to pollinate the trees so that they produce a lot more fruit than they would otherwise. We do have lots of natural pollinators in the area, so we could probably do without the bees, but the way I look at it, if we use bees to pollinate the orchard, there's a fringe benefit to their being here, and that is that we get to harvest some honey in the fall.